2 minutes ago, the number crossed the wire and it stopped trading floors cold. $500 billion dollars gone, evaporated from American markets in a single cascading session. The worst monthly performance Wall Street has seen since the darkest days of the pandemic era. The Dow Jones cratered 777 points on February 27th alone. The S&P 500 bled out. The Nasdaq followed. But here is the context they're not giving you on the evening news. This was not random market volatility. This was not a correction. This was a direct consequence. A chain reaction ignited the moment Canada decided it was done playing nice. Yet here is what makes this story truly explosive. And it is the question that will haunt every section of what you are about to hear. If Canada is the smaller economy, if the United States is the most powerful trading nation on earth, then how is it possible that one country's counter-tariff strategy is now threatening to dismantle the foundational assumptions of American economic dominance? However, the deeper you go, the more terrifying the answer becomes. Because what Canada just did is not just about trade. It is about a complete restructuring of the global economic order, and your savings, your job, your grocery bill, and your retirement are sitting directly in the blast radius. Stay with me because the answer to that question, the real one, will not come until the very end. And when it does, it will change how you see everything. The surface story is simple enough, and the mainstream press has already given you the headline version. On March 4th, 2025, the Trump administration activated 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, with a separate 10% tariff on Canadian energy products under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a legal instrument originally designed for wartime economic emergencies, not peacetime trade disputes. Canada did not flinch. Within hours, Ottawa announced retaliatory counter-tariffs targeting $30 billion worth of American goods, with a second wave hitting an additional $125 billion in U.S. products. The list was surgical. American steel, aluminum, agricultural products, orange juice from Florida, bourbon from Kentucky, household appliances from Ohio and Michigan, states that mattered politically, industries whose lobbyists had direct lines to the White House. But here is what they're not telling you about that list. Canada's targeting was not random. It was copied almost exactly from the European Union's 2018 retaliation playbook. The same playbook Jean-Claude Juncker used to force Trump to the negotiating table in his first term. The EU had identified that if you hit specific congressional districts hard enough, the political pressure on the president becomes unsustainable. Canada studied that precedent, replicated it with precision, and expanded it. Now, connect that to the second event that appears completely unrelated on the surface. On February 20th, 2026, just 8 days ago, the United States Supreme Court delivered a bombshell. In a splintered ruling in Learning Resources in Versa Trump, the court struck down Trump's entire EPA tariff architecture, declaring that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs. In a single legal opinion, the constitutional foundation of Trump's entire trade war strategy was demolished overnight. The White House had no legal instrument to maintain the tariffs that had defined its economic identity for over a year. Stop and absorb what this means. Every deal, every threat, every negotiating chip built on EPA tariffs suddenly void. The administration scrambled, announcing a new global tariff of 10% under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, quickly bumping it to 15% within 24 hours. But the damage to market confidence was immediate and savage. Investors do not like policy chaos, and Wall Street priced in that chaos at roughly $500 billion of market capitalization. Gone. Now add the third connecting event, the one nobody is talking about. In January 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Beijing. He did not go quietly. He signed a landmark strategic trade partnership with China, one that by March 1st, 2026, would see China lower tariffs on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15%. Canada, a country that exports $4 billion in agricultural goods to China, had just opened a second front. The geopolitical geometry shifted in ways Washington had not modeled for. These three events, Canada's surgical retaliatory tariffs, the Supreme Court's dismantling of IPA authority, and Carney's Beijing pivot, are not separate stories. They're three acts of the same play. And the master question we planted at the top of this video, how does a smaller economy threaten the world's largest, is beginning to answer itself. But we are not there yet. What comes next reveals the hidden hands pulling the strings behind all three of these moves. Let us talk about the players and let us be clear. What they say publicly and what they're actually doing are two entirely different games being played on two entirely different boards. Start with Donald Trump. The stated rationale for the tariffs has always been national security and trade fairness. Protecting American steel workers, eliminating the trade deficit, forcing manufacturing back to U.S. soil. The data is clear that none of these goals have been achieved. The Tax Foundation confirmed that Trump's 2026 tariff regime amounts to an average tax increase of $700 per American household per year. U.S. imports dropped by an estimated $800 billion in 2025. But that did not mean American factories filled the gap. It meant American consumers paid more for less and supply chains buckled under the weight of uncertainty. The real motive is more complex and more strategically interesting. The tariff war is not primarily an economic tool. It is a political identity instrument. Tariffs are visible. They are dramatic. They allow a president to claim action even when the underlying economics are deteriorating. The problem is that this strategy requires the other side to fold. Canada did not fold. Now, examine Mark Carney. Carney is not a conventional politician. You know, he is a former Goldman Sachs executive and the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He understands financial warfare at a granular level that most heads of state simply do not. When he announced at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026 that Canada would pursue 12 new trade deals and double its non-U.S. exports within a decade, he was not making a campaign speech. He was issuing a structural market warning. His China gamble is particularly revealing by forging a strategic partnership with Beijing while simultaneously threatening to let the USMCA, the trade agreement binding Canada, the U.S., and Mexico together face annual reviews rather than a standard 6-year cycle. Carney effectively handed Washington two uncomfortable choices. Either negotiate on Canada's terms or watch as Canada systematically rots its trade flows around the United States. Canada currently sends approximately 75% of its exports to the U.S. Carney's stated goal is to reduce that dependency dramatically, and Beijing, for obvious strategic reasons, is more than willing to accelerate that process. Here is your pattern interrupt. Do you know what Canada exports to the United States that cannot be replaced? 40% of America's oil imports come from Canada. 100% of the uranium that powers roughly 93 U.S. nuclear reactors originates from or transits through Canadian supply chains. If Canada ever weaponizes energy, and Carney has been asked about this directly, the consequences for U.S. electricity prices alone would be catastrophic. Now look at the institutional players. The USMCA, the trade agreement Trump himself called the greatest trade deal ever made when he signed it in 2020, is now scheduled for its mandatory joint review in 2026. Canada has made clear it intends to use that review as leverage. Size analysts in Washington noted in August 2025 that the Trump administration is poised to seek additional concessions during that review. But Canada has preemptively shifted its negotiating position by signing deals with China, the EU, and a 12-nation Pacific trading bloc simultaneously. Carney has reduced Canada's desperation at the USMCA table, and a less desperate Canada is a far more dangerous negotiating partner. The WTO adds another layer. Although Trump has historically dismissed the World Trade Organization as toothless and biased, Canada has been quietly filing WTO dispute cases throughout 2025. These cases, while slow-moving, create an international legal record that other nations, the EU, Japan, South Korea, can cite as precedent for their own retaliatory frameworks. Canada is building a legal architecture around U.S. trade aggression brick by brick. What we are witnessing is not a trade dispute. It is a coordinated dismantling of U.S. economic leverage by a former ally who has decided that predictability matters more than partnership. And if that keeps you awake at night, wait until you hear what this means for your personal financial life. Let us make this completely concrete. Let us talk about you. You are sitting in your home right now, and you are already paying for this war whether you know it or not. According to a Federal Reserve report confirmed in February 2026, U.S. consumers and businesses absorbed nearly 90% of the cost of Trump's 2025 tariffs. Not China, not Canada, not Mexico, you. 90 cents of every dollar in tariff costs landed directly on American households and American companies. Here is what that looks like in your weekly life. Food prices in the United States are projected to increase by approximately 3% in 2026. According to a U.S. Department of Agriculture report published this month, that does not sound dramatic until you convert it into numbers. The average American household spent roughly $9,400 on food in 2025. A 3% increase costs you an additional $280 this year alone before any escalation in the ongoing tariff cycle. And this assumes the tariff situation stabilizes. It is not stabilizing. Canada exports billions of dollars in agricultural products to the U.S. annually. Wheat, potash for American farmland fertilization, processed foods, dairy inputs. When Canada's counter-tariffs disrupted cross-border supply chains, those disruptions did not stay north of the border. They traveled south into American distribution networks, and they compounded existing inflationary pressures that were already running at 2.7% as of late 2025. Now look at your energy bill. Canadian crude oil, specifically Alberta's oil sands production, accounts for roughly 4 million barrels per day flowing into American refineries, particularly in the Midwest. The 10% tariff Trump imposed on Canadian energy did not make American oil cheaper. It made Canadian oil more expensive to import, which raised input costs for Midwest refineries, which raised the price of gasoline and heating fuel for families in Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. The irony is almost too precise. The states that voted most heavily for the tariff agenda are paying the highest energy premium from its implementation. Your job security deserves equal scrutiny. The Yale Budget Lab calculated that all 2025 U.S. tariffs combined with foreign retaliation lowered real GDP growth by 1.1 percentage points over calendar year 2025. For context, the U.S. economy typically needs 2% to 2.5% annual growth just to absorb new workforce entrants. A 1.1 point drag is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a healthy labor market and a stagnant one. The sectors hit hardest: automotive, steel, fabrication, agricultural equipment, construction materials are precisely the sectors that employ the largest share of middle-income American workers without college degrees. Think about this for a single moment. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis all source critical auto parts from Canadian plants under deeply integrated supply chains that date back decades. When the 25% tariff on Canadian goods hit in March 2025, those automakers faced a brutal choice: absorb the costs and lose margin, or pass them to consumers in the form of higher vehicle prices. They did both. Analyst projections show that the average new vehicle price in the United States increased by approximately $2,000 to $4,000 in 2025 due to tariff-related cost pass-roughs across the North American automotive supply chain. And your savings, the S&P 500, which shed significant value in February 2020 SIXS tariff uncertainty sell-off, is sitting in your 401k. The Dow's 777-point single-day collapse on February 27th alone erased wealth from pension funds, index funds, and retirement accounts across the country. BCA Research has projected that the S&P 500 could fall to between 4,200 and 4,500 if tariffs become a sustained economic headwind. That would represent a decline of up to 40% from recent highs, a figure that would devastate the retirement savings of tens of millions of Americans who have done everything right financially. The master question still hangs in the air. But before we answer it, you need to know exactly what the next 30 days look like. And because this is far from over. Here is your 30-day forecast structured with the precision of someone who has studied every variable currently in motion. In week 1, the first 7 days of March 2026, there is a 75% probability that the Trump administration will announce additional tariff measures under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act to replace the IA instrument struck down by the Supreme Court. The administration has already demonstrated it will not accept the SCOTUS ruling as a final check on its trade authority. Watch specifically for any executive orders targeting Canadian steel and aluminum, already sitting at 35% as of August 2025, being escalated further as a show of force during the USMCA review buildup. In week 2, at approximately March 8th to 14th, there is a 65% probability that Canada and the European Union will jointly coordinate their next diplomatic response. Carney has been actively building what the Star describes as a new global trading bloc, combining the EU's 27 member states with a 12-nation Pacific trading network. If a formal coordination statement emerges from Brussels and Ottawa in the same week, markets will price it in immediately and not gently. In week 3, March 15th to 21st, there is a 70% probability of significant volatility in the U.S. dollar. As currency markets adjust to the revised tariff architecture, the dollar has already faced downward pressure from trade uncertainty, and any signal that U.S. tariff policy remains in constitutional limbo will push foreign central banks to accelerate diversification of their dollar-denominated reserves. This is the slow-motion consequence that rarely makes headlines but devastates purchasing power over years, not days. In week 4, the final days of March, there is an 80% probability that preliminary USMCA bilateral talks will either produce a breakthrough framework or collapse into formal dispute mechanisms. Canada has been explicit. It wants bilateral sector deals on steel, aluminum, and automotive supply chains resolved as a precondition for full USMCA cooperation. If those talks stall, Canada's threat to allow annual USMCA reviews rather than the standard 6-year cycle becomes a credible market-moving reality. Investment decisions, particularly in the automotive and energy sectors, will be paused or redirected away from North America entirely. Here is your final pattern interrupt before we close. The Congressional Budget Office has never, not once in its history, modeled a scenario where the U.S. simultaneously faces a Supreme Court reversal of its trade authority, a primary trading partner signing strategic deals with its principal geopolitical rival, and a mandatory review of its most important trade agreement, all in the same 90-day window. We are in genuinely uncharted territory. And the people who are supposed to be navigating it are still arguing about who has the legal authority to even hold the wheel. Now it is time to answer the question: how does a smaller economy threaten the largest economy on Earth? The answer is this: it does not do it alone. Canada was never the weapon. Canada was the trigger. The real architecture that is threatening American economic dominance is not a Canadian tariff list. It is the global coalition that forms the moment the United States demonstrates it will treat its closest allies as adversaries. When Canada signs a deal with China in January 2026, when it warns the EU about annual USMCA reviews, when it builds a 12-nation Pacific trading network, it is not just protecting itself. It is providing every other U.S. trading partner with a template, a permission structure, and a proof of concept. If Canada can pivot, anyone can. And right now, they're watching. The true cost of this trade war is not the $500 billion evaporated from Wall Street in February. It is not the $700 per household annual tax burden from tariffs. It is the erosion of the foundational trust that made U.S.-led global trade architecture possible in the first place. You cannot rebuild that trust with an executive order. You cannot reverse engineer it with a Supreme Court ruling. Once allies begin rerouting supply chains, signing deals with rivals, and treating American policy as too unpredictable to rely on, the structural damage compounds silently year after year until one day the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency. And Americans wonder how it happened so quickly. It happened like this. It is happening right now. And it started with a tariff list out of Ottawa. Earlier in this video, we walked you through how the USMCA 2026 review is the single most consequential trade negotiation in modern North American history. That review is not a footnote. It is the arena where everything we just discussed will either be resolved or permanently fractured. The full story of what both sides are bringing to that table, what the hidden red lines are, and what a failed review would mean for the American economy has not yet been told publicly. That is the video you need to watch next. Search right now for our deep dive on the USMCA 2026 collapse scenario, because what happens inside that negotiation will make everything you just heard in this video make complete devastating sense.